Hi, I'm the Pink Pastor. Welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, thank you for joining me. If you're returning, it's good to see you again. If you like the content of this video and want to see more of it, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and or leave me a comment. Let me know how it was helpful to you. If you want to get up with me personally, you can find me on Instagram at PinkPastor. You can find me on Facebook at PinkPastor365, or you can email me, pinkpastor365@gmail.com. Either way, I'm glad to be with you today. So today I'm going to talk about being queer and being a person of faith. And even more importantly, I'm going to talk about bringing those two together. I'm going to talk about the reconciling, if you will, of my faith and my queer identity. I say I'm queer. It simply is shorthand for the fact that I am a lesbian and I'm a woman of transgender experience. My wife, she's bisexual. So between the two of us, we get 3 of those letters that we find in the alphabet soup. And the reality is we are both people of faith. It's interesting because, in fact, it's something that society sends way too many messages that say, that's not possible. You know, whether it's gay is a sin, or transition is about conversion therapy, in other words, convincing us that we're not trans, or being transgender is an abomination. This is not the way we were made. This is not how it's supposed to be. This is a message we are bombarded with all of the time, and it's sort of doubly true of the faith community. They think they mean well. They think that they're helping us out, and yet so often we find that it increases things like suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts, and it makes us hard to bring ourselves to a cohesive whole. And yet, I sit here as a pastor. I was ordained in 2006 in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And when I came out as transgender, the National Church said, okay, you have gifts and will continue to serve, and that's wonderful. Not you need to change who you are to get there. I have a lot of theological training. I spent years after seminary studying the things of the Bible and the things of faith and how people work and all of that, but I also have a 4-year seminary education. 3 years in a classroom and a year under supervision of another pastor, looking at the questions of faith. And yet, after all of that, I'm still convinced it's okay to be queer and be a Christian even. Not just a person of faith, but a Christian. Oh yes, there are many other traditions out there, and many of them have loving answers to the queer community, many of which are not published frequently enough, and the reality is that I am going to need to do some work to put those videos together at a later time. But as for being a Christian, I have written a thesis on marriage, a 100-page paper, if you will, a small book, if you prefer. Probably would have been a 100 to 200-page book when I was done. And in that, I talked about, in the year 2005, so before it was cool and before it was legal in any place but Massachusetts, I talked about how the church needs to advocate in favor of single-gendered marriages. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but know that my understanding that queer and faithful are not at odds with each other is a long-standing understanding. I grew up in a church that was heavily gay and lesbian, and so I didn't grow up with the message that you had to undo your queer identity to be a person of the church. So I want to talk just a second about the Bible, right? I talked about Christian communities that I've grown up in, and guess what? I've also read the Bible. And in the Bible, I see God's love for me. I mean, let's start at the very simplest. We say, who is God? We say, God is love. That's the simplest definition of God. And to me, that means that where I see love, there also I see God. And so if love for me means that I'm loved and accepted as a person who's lesbian, or a person who's trans, or a person who's gay, or a person who's bi, or a person who's polyamorous, or a person who's asexual, aromantic, if that's where I need to be loved, if that's who needs to be loved, and if God is love, then the place you find love is where that person knows love. Now let's talk about how we read the Bible. I have a very simple way. First is I read it through the lens of how does this talk about God's love for the people of the time it was written about. But then also I do something, I start not from the Old Testament, not from the letters of Paul, but from the Gospels. I read about Jesus. I read about how Jesus spent his life hanging out with tax collectors, prostitutes, eunuchs, lepers, all of the people that were rejected by society, all of the people who weren't good enough, all of the people who weren't clean enough. And yet, it's not that Jesus didn't spend time with those who were clean. Obviously, he talks about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all of those who would have been those who are clean. But he also talks about the tax collector. He talks about the prostitute. He talks about lepers. Lepers were people that were put out of society, as far too often the gay, lesbian, and trans and other people in the alphabet soup and known as queer have been over time. He spent his time healing them. Now, some would argue that a healing of a queer person means to undo the queer, and I would argue that to heal the queer means to undo the wounds inflicted by a society that all too often tells us we're not good enough. Remember, Jesus, upon close to his departure after the resurrection, says to the disciples, "You will be known as my disciples by your love for each other." Yes, Jesus says, you will be known by your love of each other. Jesus, when asked about the most important commandment, said, love the Lord your God, and the second is like the first. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in that, we have to learn to love God. We have to learn to love our neighbor, but also we have to learn to love ourselves. That can be sometimes the more difficult thing, especially when we consider ourselves not really good enough or not really clean enough. And yet I'm here to tell you, you are. You, your queer self, is good enough. You, your queer self, is okay in God's eyes. You, your queer self, is loved. I told you earlier there are many other traditions that are not Christian. Obviously, the easy ones would be Judaism and Islam, because they're both religions that focus on Father Abraham, come from Father Abraham. But I will need to spend time on those another day, unless I want this to be a 2-hour video, which I don't really. So I'm going to continue to spend my time on Christianity for today. So one of the things that's thrown at us is about how the Bible is against homosexuality. And there's a wonderful movie being made right now called 1946. And the director, Rocky, is working on it. And I've met her, and she's a wonderful person. She's doing good work. And I will put some sort of a link in the description down below so you can see that work that she's doing. But the crux, the pinnacle of that work is really to talk about how it was not until 1946 that homosexuality was even really found in the Bible. It was a new translation that put homosexuality in the Bible. So I also want to talk about the biblical interpretation. See, because that gets into the question of when we do translation work, right? So many of the things that are used to tell us we're not okay are because of translation work. And so I want to give you a little example of how translation works, because it's not that people set out to do bad, damaging things with their translations, and yet so much is lost in translation. Consider in Genesis 2, what we're used to reading is that God formed Adam, and that Adam was ultimately put to sleep, and that when Adam woke after Adam found that God had made Eve from Adam. Well, that's a little bit of it's not a wrong translation, because we've translated two words as Adam. One is the word Adam. The other is the word Adamah. And really, both only translate well in English as Adam or Adam. We don't really have an Adamah. And yet Adamah and Adam are so different. Adamah is this earth creature. There's no reason that it needs to have a gender. There's no reason that it needs to be anything more than simply a human being, an earth creature whom God put the breath of life into. Now, Adamah is sent out to find a helper and a partner. And what's interesting is that we talk about what's supposed to be, and yet in this, God sends Adamah out to figure out who Adamah finds to be, or maybe even what Adamah finds to be an acceptable helper and partner. Yes. Adamah is made. Adamah is put in the garden. And all of the animals are brought to Adamah. And Adamah names them, but also in there, God says all of them were brought to see if an appropriate helper and partner could be found. And it was up to Adamah to figure out who that acceptable helper and partner were. And when none was found, that was when God decided to make another person out of the first person. And it's only when Adamah is awoken that we read Adam and Eve. So we don't have Adam until we actually have Eve. And yet all of that gets lost in translation. Not because we don't care, not because we don't do a good job, but because that's the nature of translation. One of the popes wrote about the preferential option for the poor, and the easy answer to the preferential option to the poor is simply to talk about those who don't have enough financial wealth, and yet the reality is that the poor would be the poor of spirit as well as the financially poor. They are literally anybody that the society is not taking care of. And so, in fact, in many ways, that would argue that there's a preferential option for those of us who identify as LGBTQIAA+. But that's not always convenient for everybody. So, this has been going on a long time, and I don't want to claim that there are no intentional efforts to suppress some of this information. There are. Consider that when I did my thesis on marriage, I was doing my research, and in my research I found out that in the Vatican archives, there is a document, and save the fact that both of the people listed are male, all of the language used is that of a marriage ceremony. And what we know is that marriage of that sort in ancient Rome would have been common enough. There's an interesting story about Joseph. Joseph has a cloak of many colors, as we've been translated it, but I've been reading some scholarship recently, and it talks about how maybe Joseph was gay, maybe Joseph was trans, it's hard to tell, but the garment that Joseph was given by Joseph's father was much more in keeping, if we look at the word used, with garments that were used by women in the Old Testament. So maybe he wasn't manly enough, and that's why his brothers sold him into slavery. That's why his brothers couldn't abide by him. And yet he was his father's favorite at the same time. All of this is surmise. We don't really know, because in fact we will never go back there to that time. But what if? See, when I start looking at the Bible, I start seeing representation of myself in that Bible, and that makes it much easier to buy into the fact that I'm okay in God's eyes. That you're okay in God's eyes. So I want to go into one last example, and that's in the book of Acts. And it's the Ethiopian eunuch. Eunuchs were people who had been castrated, usually for the courts. In this case, it had been the queen's court. So we have an Ethiopian eunuch who was serving the queen, and is riding along in a carriage and then is proselytized. So first off, can I simply point out that the disciples obviously had no preconceived notion that they shouldn't be proselytizing this person just because they were outside the norm of gender? No, they were outside the norm of gender, and that was okay, because the church was a place that accepted everybody. And when it came down to it, after the message of Jesus had been given to this eunuch, the eunuch asked, so what is there to keep me from being baptized? And in that moment, they found a puddle, and the eunuch was baptized. And except for the thousands that are part of the day of Pentecost story, this is the first named convert to Christianity. And you want to tell me that I'm not okay? You want to tell me that queer people are not okay, and yet the very first named convert was a queer person? So know this, those who are watching. Yes, we're queer, and yes, we're okay. We're okay with Jesus, we're okay with God, we're okay biblically. I could go through examples from the Bible all day long, where I find myself and know myself to be accepted and a child of God. Know that I am okay with Jesus just as I am, in my full queer glory. So I leave you with this today. I know I and you who are watching this were knitted in the womb, as we are. Me as a lesbian woman of transgender experience, the person you see before you. You as the person you know yourself to be. That's right. You were knitted in the womb as the person you know yourself to be at your heart and your core. And God loves you, all of you. Grace and peace to you. May this day and all those to come be blessed. Again, if you have a comment or a thought, I ask you and invite you to please leave them down below. Until next time.